Okay, good evening, students. Tonight's homework will be about John Adams' presidency, 1797 through 1801. Please take notes in the prescribed method. Okay, you will be taking notes in Cornell Notes form tonight. Please answer the three questions in Cornell Notes form. Why was the election of 1796 weird, and what problems did it cause? What was the XYZ affair, and why did it make Adams seem strong? What was the Alien and Sedition Act, and how did it doom Adams' presidency? Then lastly, please summarize the notes by asking or answering whether you believe Adams was a good or bad president. While George Washington assigned himself as a Federalist, he was sort of above political parties. So the election of 1796 was the first time two political parties would face off against each other. And these two political parties would be the Federalists, led by Vice President John Adams, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was the Democratic Republican candidate. People enjoyed his stance on small government and his stance on political and personal freedoms of the normal people. Many people felt that Alexander Hamilton was the most fit person to run as the Federalist candidate. However, the fact that he was born in the West Indies and his issues with financial reforms would lead to a loss for the Federalists, and so therefore he stepped aside and picked somebody new. Hamilton's handpicked choice was Thomas Pinckney. He thought that if Thomas Pinckney won, Hamilton could control him, and essentially Pinckney would be Hamilton's puppet. The third man was Vice President John Adams. John Adams was a Federalist, but was known for being extremely fair and ethical. He was very strong-minded. He had a lot of political experience, serving during the Continental Congress, as well as being ambassadors to both France and the Netherlands. He was somebody whose ethics stood above all others and would not be controlled by his party. The election was close, but Adams wins with 71 electoral votes, 51% of the electoral vote possible. Adams takes the presidency, but according to the Constitution, the runner-up would become vice president, and that is Thomas Jefferson. This is a conundrum for the entire country because what it does is it has two pit men on opposite political parties in the two top offices of the country. This would create significant problems in the countries because for essentially the 4 years of Adams's presidency, his top advisor was also his top political rival and would seek to undermine him wherever possible. The first problem that Adams had to deal with was the issue with France. During the Washington presidency, the United States decided to remain neutral. However, the French Revolution continued to grow, and France began attacking American ships, hoping that they would not help the British. Now, Jay's Treaty gave specific help to British sailors by helping them trade with America. France saw this as Americans leading towards the British side, and they wanted the same treatment from the Americans. Now, Adams wanted to seek the neutrality agreement that Washington had as well, but he did need to deal with the issue at hand. And so Adams sends three commissioners, John Marshall, Charles Pinckney, and Eldridge Gerry, to negotiate a peace with the French. When the three arrive in Paris, the French foreign minister, Talleyrand, would refuse to see them. However, after weeks of waiting, the minister sends three French agents known as X, Y, and Z. They demand $10 million from the Americans plus $200,000 just to simply meet with them or have them meet with their foreign minister. Feeling like they are bullied, the American commissioners refused to talk with the French foreign minister and refused to pay the bribe. The American ships and French ships begin to attack each other again, and essentially Federalists in Congress want Congress to declare war on the French to restore American honor. Essentially, to this what we call the XYZ affair, they create a slogan saying millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. Essentially, the commissioners felt that that they were being coerced into talking with the French. They return home as national heroes, and Adams is seen as incredibly strong for taking a strong stance against the French. The XYZ affair is memorialized in this political cartoon. On the left, you have the American ministers or American commissioners. On the right, you have X, Y, and Z, essentially Jacobean heads of the French government. You can see a guillotine with a dead body in the background who has had their head cut off, essentially showing how horrible the French were. Now, the American response to the XYZ affair was swift and it was aggressive. First off, they ended the Perpetual Alliance with the French. They created a naval department and the Navy, and Congress appropriated basically triple the budget for the Army, and they built 40 warships, this becoming the first American Navy. George Washington decides to come out of retirement to lead American forces, and American privateers, or what we would call pirates, began attacking and seizing French ships. Now, during this time, a travesty of justice happens where Congress pushes through what we would call the Alien and Sedition Acts. These are aimed at keeping refugees from both sides of the French Revolution from having influence over the American government and keeping what we would call seditious ideas out. The Alien and Sedition Acts was two parts. The first part was the Alien Act, meaning keeping foreigners out of America. So first off, the Naturalization Act increased the eligibility of citizenship from residency from 5 years to 14 years. It also allowed the president to arrest or expel enemies in times of declared war. This let Adams get rid of any foreigners that they believe could threaten the United States, whether they be British or French. Now, the bad part of the Alien and Sedition Act was the Sedition Act itself. What the Sedition Act did was made it a crime to impede the operation of law, and it essentially made it illegal to publish or speak any scandalous or malicious or critical material of the government or high government officials. So essentially, you could not insult the president in public or in writing without facing possible arrest. This leads to many Democratic Republican editors of newspapers to be arrested and imprisoned, most notably Matthew Lyons, who is a Democratic Republican congressperson from Vermont, who was arrested for calling Adams a fool and saying he should be sent to the madhouse. However, he wins re-election while in prison. Now, Vice President Jefferson and James Madison look for a way to get around the Alien and Sedition Acts because they say that they violate the First Amendments and they were an invasion of states' rights, which they clearly were. Find their idea in what they would call states, or in a philosophy called states' rights. And so they asked the legislatures of Virginia and Kentucky to pass what they would call the Virginia and Kentucky Resolves, drafted by Jefferson and Madison. It essentially said that the Constitution was a compact between sovereign states and that each state had equal rights to judge for itself when the Constitution was being violated, and that a state can declare a law of Congress unconstitutional. Essentially, neither one of these resolutions was really taken up by any states. However, what it does do is it creates the idea that a state can have more power over its laws than the federal government can. And this creates what we would call sectionalism and states' rights debates that really affects the country later on, especially during the Civil War, because this argument is used two separate times in history to essentially say that states have the right, further rights over their own government than the federal government, and this is the argument that is used to protect slavery in the southern states. Now, after seeing the United States' strong response to the XYZ affair, essentially the French decide that they are going to renege on their demands of the Americans. They do not want war with the Americans because they're already at war with most of Europe. They don't need to add another enemy to that, which also would forge alliance between the Americans and the British. They will accept new negotiators without a bribe, and they can discuss a treaty. Now, many of the Federalists still wanted war with France, and if they couldn't have France, they would go to war with Spain instead. Essentially, they needed war in order to cement their power. They felt Spain was weak. It controlled Florida, New Orleans, and Louisiana, which were large territories in America. And also, Spain could cut off trade for the Mississippi whenever it wished. Therefore, they needed to be removed from North America and power. Adams remains cool under pressure. He sends ministers to France and Spain to negotiate treaties, which he does both successfully. This very much angers the Federalists, especially Alexander Hamilton, who actively works against Adams in the next presidential election, essentially costing him the election. This also, however, shows off the integrity of President Adams by essentially saying he's going to. It is important to note, however, that John Adams is removed from the presidency in the next election, losing to Thomas Jefferson. And this election, in fact, does cost Alexander Hamilton. So please finish up your notes and summarize your notes to tell me whether you believe that John Adams was a good or bad president, and please explain why.